name is Winnie Schrader. I am a student here at National University in the Fundamentals of Geology class. And today I have a special guest. His name is Scott Wolter. He's a forensic geologist and television host. He's best known for his host of series of America Unearthed. He's based out of Minnesota, where I am, and he is the founder and president of the American that's a word that I'm going to get hung up on. But some service inventor of the archaeopetrography is the process to use and date, understand the origins and inscribed stone artifacts. In addition to investigating and dating ancient artifacts, Wolter was involved in analyzing the damage to the concrete at the Pentagon after 9/11 terrorist attacks, and even helped the Las Vegas police investigation by a homicide victim where they found them buried in concrete. His first television appearance was the Kensington Runestone expert on the documentary The Holy Grail in America, which indirectly resulted in Wolter hosting America Unearthed. Wolter is the author of several books on geology, the Knights Templar, and theories related to pre-Columbian contact. His new book, Cryptic Code of the Templars in America, Origins of the Hooked X, is available, which has been out for a while, since 2019. The Kensington Runestone is a controversial artifact that some believe to be evidence of pre-Columbian Scandinavian exploration in North America. And here are some key points that Scott's going to cover and kind of go over what the Runestone is, and I will just let him take it from here. Hi, Scott. Hello.
Good
so,
to see
Scott.
you.
It's good to see you too. Yeah, Scott's a good friend of mine. I've been a fan of his shows and his work and the scientific discoveries he's made in the geology field. So you kind of took the Kensington Runestone under your wing and expanded on what the Runestone is about. So if you can kind of go on some of the just basic facts of what the Runestone is, what kind of rock it is, why is it important?
Okay, well, that's a loaded question, and it's actually quite complicated, but I'll try to distill it down as succinctly as I can. So in the fall of 1898, up in western Minnesota, about 15 miles west of Alexandria, Minnesota, which is about a 2-hour drive from the Twin Cities where we are right now, a Swedish immigrant farmer by the name of Olof Oman was clearing trees in preparation for farming when he and his 2 oldest sons, Olof Oman Jr. and Edward, Olof Oman Jr. was 12 at the time, Edward was 9, about to turn 10. They basically, Olof took a grub axe, he cut off the roots around the base of this roughly 25 to 30-year-old aspen tree, and then they took a winch, and after they destabilized the root system, they pulled the tree over, and this pulled the stump out of the ground as well as the tree, at the same time. Now, as the tree fell and the roots, the stump pulled up, they noticed there was this large rectangular shaped stone that was still wrapped in the roots of the tree almost directly underneath it. And when they pulled it up, it was the younger son, Edward, who first noticed that there was a long inscription carved on 2 sides of the rock. Now, eventually it would be realized that the inscription was carved in Scandinavian runes, and it was dated using something called pentatic numbers in Arabic placement, which were used back in medieval times, back in the 14th century. That date was 1362. Now, that date is very important because for 2 reasons. One, we're talking 130 years before Columbus, the guy that never set foot on the continent we now call the United States of America, that already had millions of people living here. I mean, the whole notion that he discovered anything is ridiculous, but you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
Now, this is 130 years before that, and we're talking about in the center of the continent. So when the Runestone was found at that time and was brought to academia, it absolutely flew in the face of what the accepted history was that we all understood, or what people understood at that time. So that was strike one right there. But anyway, the other thing that I think is important to understand is that the first scholar, linguist that looked at the inscription was a guy by the name of Olaus Breda, who was the professor of Scandinavian languages at the University of Minnesota. And he looked at it within the first 6 months after it was found. Now, I'm a geologist, right? And I run a
Yeah.
materials forensic lab, and my expertise level is in forensics
Rock.
on rock and concrete, right? So I
Mhm.
don't want to sit here and pretend like, I'm an expert in all this stuff. But I will say this. Once I understood that the runestone was real, we'll get into the reasons why that is. I then became very interested in the inscription. I wanted to understand what it said, what was understood at the time that it was discovered, and then what would happen in the years since leading up to today.
Yeah, and I also have a picture right here that
There
has
you
some
go.
of the
Yep.
inscriptions that are on the rock itself. Like you said, like to me, looking at this, I feel like I'm trying to read Japanese writing. I have no clue, but it does look old and it does look ancient.
Yeah.
It to me, looking this at, first sight, I would think it would be ancient inscriptions or something that is very old.
Well, you know what? A lot of people have said that. They look at it and it strikes them as being something that is indeed old. But, the bottom line is that you can think whatever you want. You have to have facts and
Yep.
evidence to support that final conclusion, right? But
Yep.
here's something that's very important. And I want to talk about this because Olis Breda looked at the inscription and he made an attempt to try to decipher it. He was able to recognize that it was obviously medieval runes. The language was Old Swedish, but he was only able to figure out about a third of the message because there were a lot of symbols and things that he just flat out did not understand. Now, looking back at that time frame, over 125 years later, we know now that he had no chance of figuring out what that inscription was because the information to do that simply wasn't available at that time. And I'll get into a couple of examples in a second. But here's what happened that was very important and set really what was a terrible precedent. In the end, what happened was, in my view, he was unable or unwilling to say that he simply did not know what a lot of this stuff was. And I assume that there was a lot of pressure on him because at the time he was the guy, right? The professor of Scandinavian languages at the University of Minnesota. We got Norwegians and Swedes all over, and this guy can't figure it out. Well, in his mind, he concluded there must be something wrong with this. And the easiest thing to do, instead of admitting he didn't know, is to make it go away, and he declared that it was a hoax. Now, this was important for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is when you understand academia, especially academia at that time, not only in the United States, but also in Scandinavia, the one thing you did not do was trample on the reputation of your predecessors. So once he made this statement, it would take a very courageous person who really knew what they were talking about to say, no, my predecessor was wrong. This is the real answer. And you would think that it wouldn't be that difficult. But we're also talking about a difference between humanities disciplines and hard science disciplines, okay? And language, runology, history, anthropology, and archaeology are humanities disciplines. And don't get me wrong, they're wonderful disciplines, but they are not based on hard scientific method. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of these people ironically talk a lot about scientific method, but in truth, their practice showed they really didn't know what they were talking about. So, and I guess I can forgive them a little bit. What I can't forgive is if somebody doesn't know, it's okay to say that, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
make you stupid. It makes you smart. It makes you
Mm-hmm.
honest. And so anyway, the whole point is he set a very unfortunate precedent that really has carried through from the standpoint of scholars in linguistics and language and history and all this right up to this day. And it's dogged the Kensington Runestone and its authenticity because of the mistakes of these early scholars. And I'm not trying to pick on them. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just telling you the truth. So does that make sense? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, basically him saying it was a hoax and not admitting that he was wrong, which, at that time, especially like you said, in academia, and being a scholar and a professor at the University of Minnesota, the pressure, and I'm sure the university put pressure on him because this was possibly could have made a big name for the college,
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
so, with him saying, oh gosh, I don't know. I mean, I'm, he could have just said, this is as much I know. After that, but it's like him saying that it was a hoax basically set it in stone, literally.
Well, at that point,
And,
yeah. Pardon the pun, right? No,
yeah.
but I mean, it set a very important precedent, and I don't hear people talk about that at all. And I think it's important to do that because what it ended up being is something that I've seen time and time again in my years studying the Kensington Runestone. I see problems of the human condition all the time that people tend to gravitate to because they understand that, right? For
Hmm.
example, one of the arguments that people used against the runestone was Olaf Oman, created this thing to try to fool the learned, right? He had an axe to grind against academia. Now, nobody's ever been able to show any reason why he would have had an axe to grind against academia. The guy had 9 children. He was trying to survive. He was an immigrant farmer. He was, newly married when he, found the stone. He just got time for like this. And where would he interact with academics in the first place, right? He wasn't an
Right.
educated man. He wasn't a stupid man. He did have some formal education, I think, to about 6th grade equivalency, but he wasn't a scholar by any means, but he was a smart guy. And you know that when you look at the library that he had at his home, and I've been through that entire library. It had mainly to do with farming and dealing with farm animals, horses, things like that. But he was very learned. He just wasn't a scholar, right? So
Yeah, he was a blue collar worker.
yeah,
Street
he's a
smart.
farmer. He was a farmer living on his farm, trying to survive. And that argument just doesn't carry any weight. And it's not evidence anyway, but you hear about it all the time. So
Yeah.
I think what's important is for everybody to understand, what does the inscription say? Should we start with
Mhm.
that?
Yes, we can take a look again. Just,
Okay.
this is just a little piece of it, just a little
Yep.
piece of it. But here is a picture. This is the full
Hey,
stone.
who's that good looking guy?
There's Scott. And who is Darwin?
That's Darwin. Darwin Oman is a really wonderful human being. I've known him for 23 years. Oh, no, it's about 20 years now. And
Hmm.
I have to say, he's one of my closest friends, and he is the grandson of Olaf Oman. His father, William, was the youngest of the 9 children that Karen and Olaf had. And Darwin was, I think he's got one younger brother. So when you say the grandson of a guy that's been dead since 1935, the math doesn't seem to make sense, but it actually does. Darwin is
Yeah.
now 80 years old himself, but I knew him when he was about my age, or maybe a little bit younger. But he's just a wonderful guy. And based on all the research I've done, videos I've seen, and actually, I've talked to 2 people, I've interviewed them that were 99 years old when I interviewed them, who knew Olaf Oman as adults. They were 23 years old each. They're both the same age, Einar Baki and Eleanor Gunderson. But I interviewed them, and they were able to give me firsthand information about a person that is the center of this whole controversy, Olaf Oman. And
Yes.
it was really magical to hear them tell stories about this guy who they actually knew.
Yeah. And here's Olaf
There
standing
he
here
is.
with
Yep.
looking all dapper in a suit and tie. But here's,
Yeah, that's
can you
probably
explain this picture?
pardon me?
Can you now this was the ceremony that they wanted to build a monument for the
Yes,
Kensington
back in
Runestone.
1926, there was, the runestone was basically being accepted as an authentic artifact at that time. And what happened was the Masonic community in Alexandria was motivated to build a huge monument that was going to be half the size of the Washington Monument because it was halfway across the nation. I don't know who came up with that, but that's what they were going to do. And actually, there's a drawing of that monument. And so this picture you're looking at here was taken at a rally at a place called Faleens Point, which is about 3 miles from the Oman farm, as the crow flies. And there was a huge rally held there on May 1st of 1926. The whole motivation for that was to raise money to build this monument. And they did raise a lot of money. In fact, there's a letter that was written by Olaf where he talks about there were 10,000 people there that day and 3,000 automobiles. And when you think about it, back then, automobiles were a new thing and they were just coming into their own. So apparently he was impressed by that. But unfortunately, what happened a couple of years after that is we had the stock market crash and then the Depression, and this whole effort to build this monument died, right? Because the money dried up and it just wasn't important. People were too busy trying to survive. But that's how history goes, right?
Yep. And so with the Kensington Runestone and the inscriptions, obviously you've gone through and talked with linguists and figured out the majority of the text, right? Is there some of the text that you don't know what it says or is missing from the stone?
Well, the answer to that is yes. There's some details. Let me do this, Winnie. I'm going to start by telling people what the inscription says, because I'm going to refer to aspects of the inscription to answer those questions. So let's do that. Okay. So there are 9 lines of text on the face side, and then 3 lines of text on what we call the split side. We call it the split side because the runestone was originally a larger slab of rock that was split down by the carver to this 2-to-1 ratio, which is not a coincidence. And then they carved the total of 12 lines of the inscription, 9 on the face, 3 on the side. And on the face side, it starts in the upper left-hand corner. It's not Hebrew. It's read left to right. It starts with a number, the pentatic number 8. And it says 8 Gotlanders and 22 Northmen on this acquisition business / taking up land from Vinland far to the west. We had a camp near 2 shelters, 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were fishing one day. After we came home, found 10 men red from blood and death. And then we have 3 Latin letters, A, V, M. And then the last line says, save from evils. That's on the face side. On the split side, it says, there are 10 men by the inland sea to look after our ships. 14 days journey from this island, year 1362. And again, that date was carved in pentatic numbers and Arabic placement. And again, 1362 was a strange time to have a date on here. Long before Columbus, it must be a problem, so make it go away. Didn't fit the narrative. So that's what we have. Now, as far as within the inscription, there's a lot going on. For example, on line 2, the first word is actually missing because there's what we call I call it the area, where the carver was banging away and he actually hit an area where there was this cleavage, step fracture cleavage plane. And when he hit it, it caused that word to actually split off. And if you look in the upper left-hand corner of the face side of the inscription, you see an area that's blank. And that's because the first word was peeled off. And then the third line, the carver said, oh, I don't want to get in trouble here. So they moved over past that step fracture and carved the next line. But then on line 4, he decided, no, I want to go to the edge. We're going to go all the way here. And then the rest of the inscription was carved on the far left edge. But this is just one of the interesting little things that we were able to notice about the inscription during the analysis we did when the runestone came into my laboratory in July of 2000. And, you know, the funny part was when a representative who was representing the Runestone Museum was sitting down with me and basically pleading the case of the runestone. I didn't know what he was talking about. I never heard of the runestone. I had no idea what it was. Everybody else around me seemed to know what it was. And all I could say was, I think I just missed school that day. I didn't know what they were talking about. And so I told this guy, because clearly he was an advocate. And I said, dude, this is the way it works here. Okay. I'll do this analysis for you, but you need to understand that when I come back, I may give you news you're not going to like.
Mm-hmm.
And you're still going to pay me, right? So, he kind of, he got the point and he understood it and he accepted it, and away we went. So I ended up doing a tombstone study where I compared the weathering of tombstones of known age. The dates are right there, right? So we know how long they've been weathering. They contain the same mineral, the key mineral that I was looking at, which is biotite. The same mineral grain size, they're the same size, and the same weathering environment. I had to go to the East Coast up to Maine to find comparable tombstones with the like mineralogy and everything, but also the same weathering environment. And tombstones were perfect because the runestone was found actually underneath the tree. But Olaf talked about seeing a little bit of the edge of the stone protruding out of the ground, but it was angled down about a foot. So a tombstone is perfect because I took samples at, above, and below grade, right? So I could test all aspects of that weathering. And this was perfect for the runestone. So your criteria for your experiment has to be comparable. Otherwise, you're dreaming, frankly. But at the end of the day, what I concluded was that the weathering of the runestone inscription was older than 200 years based on the tombstones. And that's from the year 1898 because the runestone hasn't been in a weathering environment since Olaf pulled it out of the ground. So now you're going back from 1898 to 1698. Well, there was nobody in Minnesota at that time, maybe some missionaries or possibly a French fur trader, but Pierre Lavendré wasn't walking around the western part of the United States until the 1700s. So the early mid 1700s. So this is a quarter century before that. So we really don't have any known characters that fit that bill. And we're talking 1362. And the weathering is older than that. So my conclusion was obvious. Clearly, it's not a late 19th century hoax. That's impossible. And if it's not that, what's left? It must be genuine, right? And I said that. And that's when the trouble started.
Oh, no. So
well, you got to remember, I didn't know anything about this. I didn't know that there was a sacred paradigm of history that we've all been taught. It's basically right. And this runestone absolutely would upset the apple cart in a huge way. And it wouldn't be for many more years after that I realized why the runestone was such a threat to the accepted narrative. And it had to do with the Knights Templar. Now, we may be getting ahead of ourselves here, but that was the start of it. I was taken aback. And I asked people, I said, look, I'm not perfect. If I made a mistake in my work, point it out, I'll fix it. You have to understand my work was also peer reviewed by 8 different geologists. And some of them had questions. I answered those questions, but in the end, they all accepted my work. So, there's one other thing I think it's very important to understand, and I don't talk about this anymore in my lectures. I used to years ago, but I just don't have time now because I like to get to the new fun stuff. But here's something that's very important, Winnie, you may not realize. After I reached my conclusion on the runestone, I found out that the first state geologist of Minnesota, a guy by the name of Newton Winchell, was recruited in 1909 to study the Kensington Runestone. And I went, oh. What if he came to a different conclusion? This guy is a giant in the field of geology, right? The University of Minnesota Geology Department is called Winchell Hall. Okay, that's the guy we're talking about. first date geologist from 1875 to 1900. And, he retired in 1900, and they pulled him out of retirement to do two projects. The first one was in 1905. There was what we would now call an archaeologist. That term didn't exist back then. A guy by the name of J.V. Brower. You've heard of Broward County, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's named after him. He was actually on a Native American dig, what would be an archaeological dig, up in northern Minnesota in 1905, and he died of a stroke. And he was in the process of compiling all this data to write a book about, the Aborigines of Minnesota. Winchell was called out of retirement in 1906 to complete that work for Brower. And he did that in a classic work that's called The Aborigines of Minnesota that was published in 1911. The point is that this guy was a giant, not just in geology, but also in archaeology. So he understood, all the aspects of these disciplines at that time. They really weren't scientists at the time. Anyway, in 1909, Winchell was called out of retirement to study the runestone. And he did that. And they made the runestone available to him. And I'll never forget when I was reading his report. And I'm like, well, I did that too. Well, I did that too. I did the same thing. He pulled samples off of the stone just like I did. Very small chip samples out of key areas. And he did what he called a relative age weathering comparison, using different minerals that he thought he could estimate the age of the weathering. He basically did the same thing I did. He also made a thin section. He identified the mineralogy in detail. Actually, I had one of my retired professors, Dr. Richard Ojekangas, help me do that work on the runestone. And in fact, he told me later on that another professor said to him, you might want to think twice about studying the runestone. He said it could ruin your reputation. And Dick said, no problem. I got this. I'm going to help Scott. This is science, right? I just found that to be an interesting little side note. But anyway.
Well, yeah. Well, with Winchell doing exactly what you did, and the result. Oh, well, we haven't really gone over what his results were. So
I'm going to tell you that now. I'm going to tell you that.
You tell me that, and then I have a follow-up question for you.
Now, remember, my butt is puckered up so hard because if this guy comes to a different conclusion, my career is over. Okay.
Yeah.
So I gutted it out. I read the report, but then there was a cover letter that he wrote to this 76-page report that he submitted to the Historical Society. And this is what he wrote in the last sentence. Ready? I have it memorized. The said stone is not a modern forgery and must be accepted as a genuine record of exploration in Minnesota at the date stated in the inscription. And you know what I did after I read that, Winnie?
What'd you do? You filled the shoes. I
did. The pucker kind of loosened up. But no, I mean, the more I thought about it, the more I realized I shouldn't have been nervous, because all I did 90 years later was independently replicate what he already did. And you know what that's called? Scientific method.
Exactly.
So now you've got two geologists, you got some jackwagon that's still alive today, but you've got a giant who reached the same conclusion. So
that's why I wanted to ask you, with him being such a big, like a giant in both geology and archaeology.
Yeah.
Why didn't his report?
Great question. Well, actually, there's a story behind that. And what happened was, I didn't tell you the first part. What prompted the investigation in the first place is back in 1905, there was a Norwegian scholar, a guy by the name of Helmer Holen, who was up in Douglas County, and he was in the process of doing research where he was interviewing Norwegian immigrants, and he was writing a book about Norwegian immigration. And he was talking to somebody not far from Kensington, and they said, "Oh, you should go talk to that farmer, Olaf Ullman. A few years ago, he found a Viking stone, right?" And so what had happened was, remember, in 1898 and the spring of 1899, Olaus Breda had dismissed the stone as a hoax, and they sent it back to Olaf Ullman, and he accepted it. He said, "Oh, it's a fake? Fine." And he put it in the granary inside the shed. It's called the granary at that time, inside the shed. The rumor is he used it as a doorstep, but he never did. That was important for me because if it was outside for a significant number of years, then I have to take that weathering into consideration. But in fact, it wasn't, right? That's one of those rumors that's been pervasive to this day. In any case, Olaf Ullman took it back, he put it in the granary, and he accepted it. In 1907, Helmer Holland showed up at Ullman's farm and said, "I hear you got the stone." And Olaf took him in the granary and showed it to him. And he said, "Wow, this is incredible." He said, "I'd love to buy this from you. Would you sell it for $5?" And Olaf said no. He said, "Well, will you sell it for $10?" And Olaf said no. And then he's like, "Well, I don't have any more money." And he said, "I tell you what, you're a scholar, you want to study it, take it, and when you're done, give it back." Mm-hmm. And that was the agreement, but it was a verbal agreement, right? Mm-hmm. So this is another thing that a lot of people got caught up in because they said that Olaf Ullman sold him the stone, and he never did. And I'll get to the end of that story in a second. So what happened is Holland took it back, and he did his linguistic studies, and he actually did some good work. And then he went to the Minnesota Historical Society and said, "I've got this amazing artifact. I'll sell it to you for $5,000.
Oh.
$5,000. This is in 1909. Okay.
Oh, that's probably what, equivalent to about 80,000 now.
Yeah, but okay. So what about Olaf Ullman, right? So anyway, yeah. So here's what happened. So they recruit Winchell, and Winchell did his geological work in the fall of 1909. And then he wrote his report, and it was published December 12th of 1909. In the following year, in the spring of 1910, he went out to the Ullman farm 3 times. And he interviewed Olaf Ullman. He interviewed his wife, Karen. He interviewed all of his kids, his friends, his neighbors in the community. He talked to people in the community that didn't believe the runestone was real. And then he had a conversation with Olaf Ullman that he wrote about. And I've got that letter in my first book on the runestone. And basically, Olaf Ullman was in the barn, and he was fixing like a cart or a wagon. And he was holding a horseshoe. And Winchell, at the behest of the University of Minnesota, they wanted to make sure that what Helmer Holland told them, that the stone belonged to him, was true. Mm-hmm. And so Winchell said to Ullman, "This guy says that this stone, you gave him the stone, and he wants to sell it to us for $5,000. Did you really do that?" And Ullman had this horseshoe in his hand, and he whacked the wheel on the wagon, and he said, "9." He was so pissed off. He said, "That's not what." Oops.
I believe that.
That's not what happened. And so anyway, what they ended up doing is the Historical Society said, "Tell you what, we'll buy out your interest in this stone for $100. Mm-hmm. And they gave him Winchell gave him a $10 down payment, with the other $90 to be paid upon successful consummation of this deal with Helmer Holland, right? Mm-hmm. So he talked Ullman off the ledge and said, "Hey, $100 is still pretty good, right? This is a historical artifact, blah, blah, blah." So anyway, so he goes back, and they decided that they were going to go ahead with it, except what they decided they were going to do, the Historical Society was going to buy this thing if and only if the Scandinavian community could weigh in on the inscription and validate it as being authentic. So what happened was Helmer Holland in 1911
Mm-hmm.
took a trip to Scandinavia. He wanted to take the trip with Newton Winchell, but
Mm-hmm.
the University of Minnesota did not vote to allow that money to be appropriated, an additional $2,000 to send Winchell over with him, to be there with him to validate, this work. So
Mm-hmm.
what happened is they set up communication. They were writing letters back and forth. And that communication between Helmer Holland and Newton Winchell in 1911 is fantastic stuff. And it was during that time that Winchell dove deeply into trying to understand the inscription. And he became very versed. He understood runes as good as any of those scholars over in Scandinavia. And the reason I can say that is because a lot of the claims that they made back then have turned out to be completely wrong. And Winchell actually was smart enough to decipher some of these linguistic, questions that these other guys could not. Anyway, so it didn't go well for Holland over in Scandinavia. These guys all dismissed it. They said it's a hoax. I'm the top scholar in the world, and what I say goes, is essentially was their argument. They were just like Breda at the University of Minnesota. They didn't know what the hell they were looking at for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
So that set another important precedent. So Holland comes back, and the University of Minnesota decided not to purchase the stone. And that was a very important thing too. And there was actually some politics that came around in the vote. There were 7 people that were voting, right? And it turns out one of the people that was voting that probably would have voted for it died. And then somebody else was was appointed to this board. And it was somebody from the University of Chicago, where a linguist by the name of George Flom had studied. And he had looked at the runestone and claimed that it was a hoax. And he told this guy it was a hoax. And it was his deciding vote that killed the deal with the university. Of course, it was all based on bogus information, but that's what happened. In any case, in 1914, Winchell died. And so what happened is his work was pushed into the shadows, right? They couldn't refute it, so you just ignore it. And
sleep it under the rug.
Yeah, and frankly, I think, there was a book written in 1967. I think we talked about this before, by Ted Blagan, the former director of the Minnesota Historical Society. And his book, basically, he concluded the runestone is probably a hoax. And we now know that he died of cancer prior to really completing his investigation. And he was really just starting to dig into Newton Winchell's work. And he was very compelled by Winchell's work. And, this is my own personal opinion after digging into all of this research. I personally believe that if Ted Blagan had been allowed to continue his research, if he had lived longer, I think he eventually would have come around and concluded it was authentic. And we'd be talking about the runestone in a completely different way today. But that's how history goes. And it's also a lesson in understanding the impact of the human condition, right? That people can be persuaded by a charismatic argument more than they can by scientific facts sometimes. And it's just a sad thing, but it's true.
Exactly. And, and that's why I think the way with you were doing with the research and the testing and things like that, because I would have never thought testing the engravings could really date something, or, because it's just like, and thinking outside the box and not just the normal traditional scientific method, but you're adding that human element in a logical way.
Right.
And, like saying, let's test this inscription, date the inscription. That's good. Don't worry about what it says. When was that put there? That's the important factor on the runestone, is to authenticate its actual date.
You know what, Winnie, that's a really good point. And I hadn't thought about it the way you the way you couch that is actually really good. I mean, let's forget about the inscription and what it says for a second, right? Let's just look at the geological aspects, and the geology says this thing is old, therefore it's authentic. Now let's dig into figuring out what it says. And I think, now that I think about it, if that approach had been taken, I think we would have a completely different narrative today, or it would be harder to tap it down, right? So
yeah, because it seems like the basis of what the naysayers or the opposition of the runestone, all their focus is on what it says, and
well,
that
yeah,
it's like,
no, that's what, and that's what they used, to frame their argument. But as it turns out, what they thought it said was not at all what it said, because they didn't understand the runes, the language, the dialect, the grammar, all that stuff. But let me just go back again to when I reached my conclusion. I was satisfied with Winchell. That really gave me a lot of confidence. I already knew the work I had done was solid. It had been peer reviewed, and I was feeling really good about it. And then the pushback came. But the one thing that I always hung my hat on back then and still today is that I trusted the rock. I don't trust some people. The rock said it was old. The rock said it was authentic. Therefore, if that's true, and that's what the rock says, then somebody carved it. They came from some place, and they came here to the center of the continent for some reason. Now, these are three things that are absolute truths, right?
Yeah.
Right. So what that also means, and what it also told me, is that I don't know shit about this inscription. But if it's authentic, what it does mean is that everything that is in this inscription must be consistent with the 14th century. It has to if it's real, right?
Yes.
So taking that a step further, what that also means is that the academics that said that this thing is a hoax, that these runes, this dialect, this grammar, all this stuff never existed, it means they're wrong. Now, these are a lot of bold statements, but if you think about it from the standpoint of logic, they're not statements, they're absolute truths. They are true. So at that point, that's when I decided I'm going to see if I can find this stuff. It has to be there somewhere. So for 2.5 years between 2013 and 2003 and 2005, I went to Sweden 5 times.
Wow.
And guess what? I found everything.
You did?
Everything the scholar said didn't exist, in fact, did exist, as it had to. I knew it was there. It was just a matter of finding it. Now, a lot of people listening to this, and I've said this before, might say, oh, look at you, Scott. Aren't you special? You went over there in their backyard and found what they didn't know about? How can that be? Well, the truth of the matter is, where all of this stuff existed was on an island in the Baltic Sea called Gotland. And there are hundreds of medieval runic inscriptions on that island. There's some Viking era inscriptions there too, but primarily hundreds of medieval inscriptions. And they were all inside primarily carved on grave slabs, mortared into the floors of the churches on this island. There are 99 churches on that island. I went to every one. And I did. I'm anal retentive. Okay. I got a problem. I need some therapy. I need coaching. I need something.
You just love information. That's all.
I'm just a detail freak. And, the one church that I didn't go to would have, the big magic thing. Right. But anyway, that's where everything was. But my point is, those runic inscriptions, the scholarly research was not published until the early 2000s. So I was really the first person to look at those inscriptions in context with the runestone.
Okay.
I was the first one to do it. So, I'd like to paint myself, out to be special here, that I was the magic guy that found this stuff. But the truth is, I was the first person to really do this.
Yeah, make the
again, in
comparison
context
with the
of the runestone.
runestone. Yep.
But I
Mhm.
can tell you this, it pissed him off greatly.
No,
But
I'm sure it did.
well, you know what? I mean, that's just childish, right? What it should
Yeah.
have done is inspired them. Hey, here's a
Mhm.
whole new avenue of investigation that nobody's ever done before. I'm going to be the first one, right? That's what they
Mhm.
should have done. But they still
Yes.
stick their head in the sand and they try to deny. There have been a few scholars that have actually figured it out and done good work, but by and large, what people think. But
Yeah,
these are stories that people just are not aware of that are part of the story, and I think they're important to put it all into its proper context.
oh, for sure. Because like especially when you're trying to when you have two different opposition sides with scientific uh, facts, and then you have the injecture of human element. So, sometimes the human element, they're so stubborn and bullheaded that they won't look at any other human aspects like you doing the independent research, finding other runes to compare to the rune stone, which they didn't have access, obviously, because it wasn't published until the early 2000s. But that's when they should have said, okay, well, we didn't have that information. Let's add this to the fold and then come out with a new theory or hypothesis based off this new information that's coming in from Scott. Uh, to me, that would help the scientific community greatly, but I get why some of these academic scholars don't like to take the hit to the ego. And that's that human element, the ego element, that
Yeah,
has really hurt the rune stone through these centuries of going through all this research and just, you having to independently and then come up with this stuff. And then you bring it to academia aspects, and they're just like, no,
yeah, yeah. It's
it,
you know
uh,
what, Winnie? I mean, as I was going through this, there were times I felt myself getting caught up in this and being emotional. I mean, being personally attacked by these people. Um, I mean, we almost, I was in Sweden one time and I was there with Dick Nielsen, who I co-wrote that first book with, Compelling New Evidence. Um,
mhm,
and Dick and I were involved in a debate. And there were 200 people in the audience, and there was a geologist and an archaeologist and a linguist that we were debating. And we actually had them tied up in knots with factual information that they just could not refute. So they resorted to insults, and they
yep.
basically went after Dick Nielsen. And they said, "You know nothing about old Swedish. You're an American," and blah blah blah. And they said this stuff. And I stood up and I said, "Look, if you don't shut your damn mouth, I'm going to come over there and shut it for you." And I looked at Henrik Williams, who was the moderator, and I said, "Henrik, are you going to do something about this? These are your guys. These are
Mhm.
linguists that are coming after us." And Henrik stepped in, and he diffused the situation, but it was very testy. And I just found that interesting that these people got to the point where they had nothing else but insults, right?
Yep,
And,
exactly. And
and well, I'm upset with myself that I got caught up into it, right? But
yeah.
but after this thing was over and everybody calmed down, right? I'll never forget it. It turns out that there were members of the Oman family, Olaf Oman's brother and sister, and their children's grandchildren and great grandchildren were at this debate, because the debate was held up in Helsingland, which is a town right next to where Olaf Oman immigrated from in Forsadalen parish. Anyway, they came up to us, they introduced themselves, and eventually they shared a bunch of letters that Olaf Oman had written back to his family back in the 1800s, early 1900s, that the world had never seen. And he talked about the runestone. So
He
those
did.
were some fantastic discoveries that gets more into the personal side and how it affected him and his family that the world had never seen, right? And at
Mhm.
one point, I'll never forget it, the matriarch of the family at that time, her name was Brita Blank. And I was introduced to her, we had a conversation, and then at one point she kind of stood off by herself And she didn't know that I was looking at her, but I heard her say this. She just kind of looked off into the distance and she said, "This stone makes people do strange things."
Yeah. Yeah. If you want to talk about kind of a weird aspect of the stone, it makes people argue and do weird stuff.
Yeah. Well, it was very prophetic. And, and I always think about that when I start getting wound up myself, because I have a propensity to get wound up when I feel like
You have
I
passion.
need to. But, you got to keep your cool. And, that's served me well. So I always remembered Brita's wise words. So
Wise words by Brita. Well,
yeah,
with that being said, I mean, the rune stone, whether, like you said, whatever the inscription, the dating of the inscription, no matter what it says, if it read Mary had a little lamb in 1362, well, then apparently if the inscriptions are dated at 1360, then Mary had a little lamb has been around since then.
that's
So
what that is exactly what that means.
exactly. So with that being said, to me, with the testing and everything that you've done, and I trust your scientific methods and testing, and because I've seen your reports, so and you've showed me all this stuff, I really feel like the work that you've done with the rune stone has really authenticated the history of our country. Well, even just this continent, actually, the northern. Well,
I think you said it right. This all ties into the true story of the founding of America, and you're absolutely right. But I want to make one thing perfectly clear here, and this is something that's important. A lot of people have tried to give me credit for solving the Kensington Runestone, and I appreciate that, and I will always be proud of the work that we've done. We've certainly added, and I think push the ball down the field, a good ways, right? But let's be clear. The person that deserves credit for solving the Kensington Runestone is not me. It's not Dick Nielsen. It's Newton Winchell, because he was the first guy to say that it was an authentic artifact. Unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to understand or be appreciated for the work that he did. I replicated what he already did. So he's the guy that deserves credit. And, I just want to make sure that that's understood. I'm honored and privileged to have walked in his footsteps in a small way. But I got to tell you, the more you learn about Newton Winchell, the more you'll appreciate what I'm saying. He was truly a giant, and he deserves all the credit.
Yeah, and you're just carrying the torch from his great works.
And I'm going to hand it off to somebody else.
That's how history and science work together. It gets passed down centuries, decades, and who knows, in 50 years, they might find something new on the Kensington Runestone, and we won't.
Oh, they will. They will. I'm telling you, this is the most complicated thing I have ever worked on my life. Worked on ever in my life. How much longer do you want to go? I don't mean to cut it off, but I know I have food that I can smell. I'm getting hungry. But
we're wrapping up right now, because I was just about to post to let people know where they can go, see kind of information that you put out there on the web, and you do have a blog where people can reach out and ask questions, and you respond. Just be polite to Scott. Don't be mean.
They can take all the shots they want. It's all right. Tough guy behind the computer.
So if you definitely want to speak with Scott or learn more about what Scott does and all of his research, because he also has the hook decks, which is a whole other topic that we can in the future get into, which has appeared on the wonderful Kensington Runestone, but it's been spotted throughout the world. So Scott can connect the dots on that for you guys. But you also have your blog at scottwolteranswers.blogspot.com. Do I have that correct?
You got it right. That's it. And anybody that has a question or a theory, or if they want to call me out for some reason, I mean, call me a name, but have a reason, why, or something to back it up. And but I always, I mean, I always answer people on my blog, and you can see the books on the hookedx.com site. And Winnie, I have 2 new books that are going to be coming out in 2024. One is going to be The Secrets of Oak Island Revealed, and they will be revealed. I mean, for real. They all connect with this story. And the other book is going to be about the larger story of the Knights Templar who carved the runestone, by the way, in 1362, which was only a few decades after the put down in 1307. And of course, the big question is, what happened to the Templars? Where did they go? They disappeared into history. No, they didn't. They just finished the job that they started, which was to establish a new Jerusalem, a new Atlantis, a new sanctuary in a place where they could live free from the tyranny of the monarchs of Europe, free from the persecution of the Roman Church, where the rights of the individual, they are born with certain inalienable God-given rights. This is a Templar tenet, and this served as the framework for the Constitution of the United States that we now have. Regardless of color, creed, religion, sex, everybody is born with these certain rights. And that's really what the effort was all about. The runestone was a land claim to establish that they were here at that time. A lot of people have said to me, well, why didn't they pull the runestone up? And I said, because they didn't need to, because our founding fathers inherited that covenant, that mission called the covenant. They recovered the treasures that the Templars hid over here, and they used that money to fund the revolution. And our founding fathers, who were all Freemasons, they were also Knights Templar, they just didn't tell anyone, created this amazing country that we now call the United States of America. And so the runestone plays a vital role in that story. And frankly, we need to really understand that story and appreciate it more than ever, because this republic that was founded by those Freemasons and the Templars before them is in jeopardy. And so it's really, really important that we have this discussion, that we understand the truth about what happened, because it's vitally important if you call yourself an American.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Scott, for your time. I'm excited to show this to my class. Like you, I have passion I'm more of the archaeology side of things. I like, Indiana Jones and stuff. Honestly, an archaeologist is kind of like a geologist and a historian at the same time. It's kind of like they're kind of work in tandem. They just don't know a lot of like the technical scientific stuff, but I love artifacts and the Kensington Runestone. I have personally seen it in person myself at the Runestone Museum in Alexandria, Minnesota.
Yep.
It's a small little town, but it was amazing.
Nice museum,
go in there and just
very
see
nice
it.
Museum.
Yes, it's very Minnesotan.
Old Minnesotan for sure.
Oh yeah, it is. But thank you so much for your time, Scott, and hopefully we can revisit on another topic and whatnot. And I appreciate all the help that you've given me for my geology class. And
okay, if you get a good grade, you owe me a beer.
Okay, I'll get you a beer. I'll try to get you a case of beer. All right. Well, thank you so much, Scott, and we hope to speak with you soon.
Thank you, Winnie. I really appreciate it. And say hi to that lug that you're married to when you get a chance.
Okay. All right. Well, have a wonderful evening.
Okay. Thank you.